My name is Sophia Perez. I am 33 years old. 2 years ago, my family took advantage of my divorce to push me into signing papers they downplayed as simple planning for my house I had lived in for 22 years. Now, everything collides as I sit in my lawyer's office in Cheyenne learning. They changed the locks on my $2 million home and tried to file a transfer while I was away for a week on business. Their calls flooding my phone with demands to accept it as family help. The shock is raw, but my resolve is steel. I will not let them erase my independence, no matter how isolated it leaves me. If you have ever felt your own family quietly working to take what you built without a single honest conversation, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what your breaking point would be. I read every single one because stories like this remind us we are not alone. To understand how I ended up in that lawyer's office with my stomach in knots and my phone buzzing nonstop, I have to take you back to the way it all started creeping in after my divorce. I had been married for 7 years to a man who left one morning with little more than a note and half the savings, and the house in Cheyenne was the one stable thing I had left. I bought it myself with every bonus and overtime hour from my job as a senior financial consultant, pouring my heart into the backyard garden and the quiet evenings on the porch where I could finally breathe again. My family had always been close on the surface with Sunday calls and holiday dinners, but after the divorce, they shifted in ways that felt off from the beginning. My mother was the one who started it, calling me late one evening 3 years ago while I was still unpacking boxes from the split. She sounded so concerned, her voice soft, like she was reading from a script she had practiced. She said the house was too big for one person, that the yard alone would wear me down, and maybe it was time to think about something smaller where I could have help if I ever needed it. My father chimed in on the speakerphone, agreeing too quickly, and my older sister jumped in with a story about her own friend who downsized and never looked back. I brushed it off at first because it felt like normal family worry, the kind you expect when life falls apart. But the conversations kept coming back, always wrapped in that same careful circling. My mother would drop by on a Saturday with coffee and mention how property taxes were rising and how nice it would be if the equity could help my older sister and her husband with some of their own bills. My father would nod along, but then he would suddenly change the subject to the weather or ask about my work deadlines, his eyes darting away like he knew the words were landing wrong but could not stop them. My older sister was bolder about it. She would text me links to smaller condos in town and say things like how I had always been the independent one, but maybe now was the time to let family step in. It never felt like a direct attack, just this slow pressure that made me question if I was being stubborn for wanting to keep what I had earned. I started noticing little things that did not add up. My mother would ask to see my latest bank statements under the guise of helping me budget after the divorce, and my father would offer to review my mortgage papers because he had done some real estate deals years back. My older sister even brought over a financial advisor. She knew a guy who spent the whole dinner talking about how liquidating assets early could set everyone up better. I signed a couple of documents they brought over one evening at a casual family barbecue, the kind where we grilled burgers in my backyard and laughed about old memories. My mother slid the papers across the table with a smile, calling them routine updates for estate planning, so everything stayed protected if anything happened to me. I trusted them. They were my family. I skimmed the pages and signed because saying no felt like starting another fight I did not have the energy for right then. Looking back now, that barbecue was the moment everything quietly shifted. I did not know it at the time, but that was when my mother and father and my older sister started treating my house like it was already a shared family asset instead of mine alone. My colleague Emma at the office noticed I seemed distracted the next week and asked if everything was okay at home. I brushed it off, but she pressed gently, reminding me that family sometimes confuses love with control. Then my cousin Oliver stopped by one afternoon to help me fix a leaky faucet and mentioned he had overheard my mother on the phone with my older sister talking about how the house would be perfect for them if I ever decided to move closer to the family. He did not push, just raised an eyebrow and said I might want to keep an eye on things. That planted the first real seed of doubt. I decided to get ahead of it quietly. I reached out to my lawyer, Sophia Rivera, a sharp woman I had worked with on my divorce settlement. We met in her downtown Cheyenne office, and I laid out the papers I had signed. Sophia read them slowly, her expression tightening with each page. She told me the language was broader than I realized, giving my family more leverage over decisions about the property than I had ever intended. She recommended we revoke it immediately and replace it with something tighter, all without tipping them off. I agreed, and over the next 3 months, we worked in secret. Sophia helped me set up a proper trust for the house, one that kept full control with me. I also had a security system installed with cameras at every entrance, telling my family it was because of a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. My mother nodded when I mentioned it at dinner, but my father gave one of those forced laughs and quickly changed the subject to how nice the new paint looked on the shutters. My older sister just smiled and said it was smart, but her eyes lingered a little too long on the camera above the door. Meanwhile, the pressure kept building in small, cutting ways. My mother would call and say things like how I looked tired every time she saw me, how a smaller place would free up time for me to finally relax instead of always proving I could handle everything alone. My father would agree, but then interrupt himself mid-sentence and ask about my latest client at work, like he was trying to soften the jab without fully owning it. My older sister was the one who went for the throat sometimes. At a weekend cookout, she laughed and said I had always been the one who thought she did not need anyone, but maybe that was why my marriage had not worked out. My mother jumped in right after with a sigh, agreeing that family was there to carry the load. The words landed like little knives, each one reminding me that in their eyes, I was still the one who needed fixing. I kept documenting everything, just like Sophia advised. I saved every text, every email, every casual mention of the house. Then one afternoon, Sophia called me while I was at my desk at work. She had been making quiet inquiries and discovered that my family had met with a residential real estate specialist, the kind who handled private transfers. Paperwork was already in motion using the old authorization I had signed. The trust I had quietly set up meant the title they were working with was no longer valid, but they did not know that yet. My stomach dropped. I sat there staring at my computer screen while Emma walked by my cubicle and asked if I was okay. I told her I would explain later, but inside I felt the ground shifting under me. Sophia suggested we set a trap. She thought if my family believed I was distracted and far away, they might make their move. My friend Evelyn offered her place in a neighboring town for a week-long business cover story. I mentioned the trip casually to my family over a phone call, saying I was leaving a spare key with the neighbor in case of anything. I had not left any key, of course. My mother sounded pleased, saying it would be good for me to get away. My father added that he and my mother might stop by to check on the place while I was gone, and my older sister chimed in that her husband could help with any yard work. Their voices were warm, but I could hear the calculation underneath. I flew out the following Sunday, heart pounding the whole way. The call from Sophia came on Wednesday while I was sitting at Evelyn's kitchen table. They had moved that morning. My mother had coordinated the locksmith my father had been there watching, and my older sister had brought her husband to help with the new welcome mat and shutters she insisted would make the place look more family-friendly. They changed every lock and tried to file the transfer documents right after. Sophia's voice was steady as she told me the paperwork had been rejected because of the trust, but the house was now secured under their new keys. I sat very still, the coffee in front of me going cold. Everything I had built, the home I had fought for after the divorce, was now locked against me by the very people who were supposed to have my back. I thanked Evelyn, booked the first flight home, and spent the entire trip replaying every conversation in my head. When I landed, I drove straight to the house instead of calling them first. The new welcome mat mocked me from the porch, the shutters painted in a shade I had never chosen, and a camera stared down at me that I had never installed. My key slid into the deadbolt but refused to turn. I stood there for a long moment, phone buzzing in my pocket with a group text from my mother saying they needed to discuss the future as a family. My father had added a thumbs up emoji, but I knew from the way he had changed the subject so many times before that he was avoiding the real conversation. My older sister had replied that it was time I finally listened. I walked around to the back door they had not bothered to change, slipped inside, and put the kettle on like nothing had happened. The house smelled the same, but it felt different now, violated in a way that made my skin crawl. I called Evelyn first and then Sophia to confirm the next steps. The trap had worked, but the real confrontation was just beginning. My phone lit up again with a call from my mother. I let it ring twice before I answered, my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking. She started right in her tone, laced with that familiar mix of concern and command. "Sophia, we did this for you because you clearly cannot see what is best right now. The house is too much, and your older sister needs the stability more than you do alone." My father was on the line too, but instead of backing her up silently, he let out an awkward laugh and tried to pivot, saying, "Maybe we could all sit down and look at options together like reasonable adults." My older sister jumped in next, her voice sharp. "You have always been so stubborn about doing everything your way, but look where that got you last time." The words cut deep, each one reminding me how little they thought I could handle on my own. I told them I was inside the house already and that we needed to talk in person. They arrived 20 minutes later, piling through the front door with their new keys like they owned the place. My mother took one look at me sitting at the kitchen table with the folder of documents, and her expression hardened. My father shifted from foot to foot, then suddenly suggested we all have some tea first to calm down his way of dodging the explosion he could feel coming. My older sister crossed her arms and demanded to know why I was making this harder than it had to be. The air in the room felt thick with everything we had never said out loud before. I laid the papers out one by one, explaining exactly what Sophia had uncovered and how the trust had protected what was mine. My mother's face flushed, but she recovered quickly with the sarcastic edge I had never heard so plainly. "You always did love your little secrets, didn't you? Hiding behind lawyers instead of trusting family?" My father tried to interrupt with another topic change, asking about my work trip, but the damage was already spreading. My older sister leaned forward, her voice low and vicious. "This is not just your house anymore. It is about all of us, and you refusing to see that is what is tearing us apart." The words hung there heavy and final, and for the first time, I saw the full picture of how long they had been planning this behind my back. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them that the lawyers would handle the rest from here and that I needed space to think. My mother started to argue, but my father placed a hand on her arm and for once did not laugh or change the subject. He looked almost disappointed in himself as he suggested they give me the night. They left, but the tension followed me like a shadow. That night I lay awake listening to the new camera outside, clicking softly every time a car passed, wondering how many more conversations like this one I could take before the family I had known my whole life simply stopped existing for me. The next morning, my cousin Oliver texted me asking if I was okay. He had heard from Emma at work that I looked wrecked when I came in late. I met him for coffee and spilled the whole story. Oliver listened without interrupting, then said quietly that he had always suspected my mother and my older sister were pushing too hard but had not wanted to step in uninvited. His support felt like the only solid ground I had left. Emma called me later that afternoon from the office offering to cover my clients if I needed time off. Their kindness only highlighted how alone I felt facing the people who were supposed to love me most. By the end of that week, the legal papers were filed, and Sophia warned me that the process could drag on for months. My family kept texting, each message a new mix of guilt and demands wrapped in concern. My mother would say how much she worried about me living there alone. My father would add a quick note about how we used to be a team. And my older sister would remind me that her husband had already lined up contractors to make the place more suitable for everyone. The pressure never stopped, just changed shape. I started sleeping with the lights on, half expecting to wake up to another surprise at the door. One evening, My phone rang with a call from my mother while I was reviewing the latest update from Sophia. I almost did not answer, but something in me needed to hear it one more time. She launched right in without greeting. Sophia, this stubbornness is not like you. Your father and I built this family on looking out for each other, and you are throwing it away over a house. My father was listening in the background, but instead of his usual topic change, he stayed silent for once, the quiet stretching until it felt like an admission. My older sister grabbed the phone next and delivered the sharpest jab yet. You have always thought you were better than the rest of us, but this proves you are just selfish. The line went dead after that, but the words stayed with me long into the night. I knew then that the real fight was not about the house anymore. It was about whether I could keep any piece of myself if I stayed tied to them. The cameras kept recording, the lawyers kept working, and I kept showing up to work each day pretending everything was fine, while inside I felt the family ties unraveling thread by thread. Emma noticed the change in me at the office and pulled me aside one afternoon asking if I needed to talk. I told her enough to let her know the situation was escalating, and she offered to be my ride or die if things got ugly. Oliver texted daily check-ins, his messages the only bright spots in a week that felt like it would never end. Then came the call I had been dreading. Sophia's number flashed on my screen just as I was leaving the office. She said my family had pushed harder than expected, and that a new set of documents had surfaced this time involving my older sister's husband trying to co-sign something on the property. The trap was closing, but so was the door on the life I had known. I stood in the parking lot with the wind whipping around me, phone pressed to my ear, realizing that no matter how this legal battle turned out, the real cost was going to be the family I was about to lose for good. I hung up with Sophia after she walked me through the details, her voice crisp and professional, as she explained that my older sister's husband had tried to add his name to a new set of transfer papers claiming some nonsense about joint family planning. The documents referenced the old authorization I had signed at that backyard barbecue, the one my mother had slid across the table with her sweetest smile. My hands were still shaking when I got into my car, and the drive home felt like it took forever, even though the streets were empty. When I pulled into the driveway, the new welcome mat stared back at me like a taunt, and I could not shake the feeling that everything I had worked for was slipping away faster than I could grab it. The next morning, my phone started blowing up before I even made it to the office. My mother called first, her tone dripping with that familiar mix of fake worry and cold command. She did not even say hello. She launched right in with how I had always been the one who put herself first, even when the family needed me to step up and think about the bigger picture. My father was on the line too, and instead of his usual quick topic change, he let out a sharp defensive outburst, raising his voice to say we were only trying to keep this family together and that my stubbornness was making everything harder than it had to be. The words hit me like a slap, especially coming from him after all the times he had dodged the hard conversations. My older sister jumped in right after, her voice laced with contempt, as she reminded me that my divorce had already caused enough drama, and now I was dragging everyone down with my refusal to share what I had. I sat in my parked car outside the office building, listening to them pile on, and for a moment I wondered if I was the one losing my mind. My mother kept going, her sarcasm cutting deeper with every sentence about how I had never really learned to trust family the way a real daughter should. My father tried to interrupt once more, but this time his outburst turned into something quieter, almost like he was realizing mid-sentence how far they had gone, and he muttered something about needing to think before hanging up abruptly. The call ended, but the damage was done. I walked into work with my head spinning, and Emma noticed immediately. She pulled me into the break room and listened while I gave her the short version, her eyes widening when I mentioned the new co-signing attempt. She offered to cover my afternoon meeting so I could call Sophia back, and her support felt like the only thing keeping me from falling apart right there. Later that afternoon, my cousin Oliver texted asking if I could meet for a quick lunch. I slipped out and found him at our usual spot where he slid a coffee across the table, and told me he had overheard my mother talking to my older sister again about how the house should have been handled differently from the start. Oliver had never been one to stir drama, but this time he looked genuinely angry on my behalf and warned me that they might try something even bolder if I did not push back soon. His words stayed with me when I got back to my desk, but before I could even open my email, another text came through from an unknown number. It was a screenshot of an email my mother had apparently sent to my boss at the firm, framing my recent absences as signs I was struggling and suggesting the company might want to give me some time off for family reasons. The message ended with a line that made my blood run cold. She had copied my older sister and included a subtle hint that my work performance had been slipping because I was distracted by personal issues. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, wondering how far they would go to make me look unstable. Emma walked by my cubicle right then and saw my face. She read the screenshot over my shoulder and let out a low whistle, telling me I needed to document everything and loop in human resources if it got worse. The rest of the day dragged while I tried to focus on client files, but every notification on my phone made my stomach twist. By the time I left the office, my mother had sent 3 more texts, each one sharper than the last, accusing me of turning a simple family discussion into a war, and reminding me that my older sister had always been the one who put the family first. My father had not texted at all since his outburst, which somehow felt even more unsettling. That evening, I reviewed the security footage Sophia had forwarded me earlier. There they were on the screen, my mother directing the locksmith like she owned the place, my father standing off to the side with his arms crossed, and my older sister pointing out where the new camera should go. Her husband lingered in the background, nodding along as they discussed the co-signing papers like it was already decided. The sight made my chest tighten, but I forced myself to save the clips and send them to Sophia. She called back almost immediately, her voice steady, as she said the new filings had been flagged by the title office and that we had a narrow window to respond before things escalated legally. She warned me that my family might try to force a meeting to pressure me in person, and sure enough, my phone lit up with a group message from my mother demanding we all sit down the following weekend to talk things through like adults. I did not reply right away. Instead, I called Evelyn and told her everything that had happened since the parking lot call. She listened quietly, then suggested I stay at her place for a couple of nights if the pressure got too intense, offering the spare room without any strings attached. Her kindness was a lifeline, but it also highlighted how isolated I was starting to feel from the people who were supposed to be my foundation. Oliver followed up with another text later that night saying he had casually mentioned the situation to a mutual family friend, and the response had been shocked that my mother would go this far. The support from the outside was real, yet it could not erase the growing dread that this fight was going to cost me more than just the house. The weekend arrived faster than I wanted. My mother's demand for a meeting hung over me like a storm cloud, and by Friday evening, another text came through from her, this one laced with even more venom. She wrote that my refusal to see reason was breaking my father's heart, and that my older sister had been crying over how selfish I was being with assets that should have helped the whole family. My father had not reached out directly since his defensive outburst on the call, but I could picture him sitting there, nodding along, avoiding the hard part until it exploded. I spent that night going over every document Sophia had prepared, practicing what I might say if they showed up unannounced, because part of me knew they would not wait for the weekend. Saturday morning, the doorbell rang while I was still in my robe, coffee in hand. I checked the camera feed, and there they were on the porch, my mother in the lead with a folder under her arm, my father shifting from foot to foot beside her, and my older sister standing tall with her husband right behind. I took a deep breath and opened the door, but before I could even speak, my mother stepped forward, her eyes locked on mine with that cold sarcasm I had come to dread. She said I had forced their hand by hiding behind lawyers, and that it was time I stopped acting like the family did not exist. My father cut in suddenly with another outburst, his voice rising, as he insisted we were only doing this because we loved me and could not watch me struggle alone anymore. The words felt rehearsed, yet the way his shoulders slumped right after told me even he was starting to see how wrong this all looked. My older sister did not wait for the tension to settle. She jumped in with a cutting remark about how my divorce had clearly left me unable to think straight and that keeping the house to myself was the most selfish thing she had ever seen me do. The air between us crackled, and for a split second I thought the confrontation was about to explode right there on the porch. My mother raised her hand to silence everyone, then looked straight at me and delivered the sharpest jab, yet telling me that if I continued down this path, I would end up with nothing and no one, because families like ours did not tolerate people who only took and never gave back. My father tried one more time to pivot, suggesting we all go inside and have coffee like civilized people, but the damage was already spreading through the group like cracks in ice. I stood my ground and told them the lawyers would handle any further discussion, then closed the door before they could push past me. The sound of their voices arguing on the other side carried through the wood, my mother's tone rising above the rest as she accused me of turning my back on everything they had ever done for me. I leaned against the inside of the door, heart hammering, and pulled out my phone to text Sophia that they had shown up uninvited. Her reply came back almost instantly. She had just received notice that my family had filed an emergency motion claiming I was mentally unfit to manage the property using the email to my boss as supposed evidence. The words blurred on the screen and I realized the trap I had set was closing, but so was the door on any hope of salvaging what was left of us. Oliver called me 10 minutes later, his voice urgent after my older sister had apparently texted him demanding he talk some sense into me. Emma followed up with a message from work saying she had heard through the grapevine that my mother had contacted another colleague too, spreading the same story about my supposed struggles. The pressure was coming from every direction now, and I could feel the walls closing in tighter with each new revelation. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the folder of evidence I had compiled, knowing the next step was going to change everything forever. But before I could even dial Sophia again, my phone buzzed with one final text from my mother. It was short, direct, and chilling in its simplicity. "We are not done here, and you will regret shutting us out." I hung up with Sophia after she walked me through the details, her voice crisp and professional as she explained that my older sister's husband had tried to add his name to a new set of transfer papers, claiming some nonsense about joint family planning. The documents referenced the old authorization I had signed at that backyard barbecue, the one my mother had slid across the table with her sweetest smile. My hands were still shaking when I got into my car, and the drive home felt like it took forever, even though the streets were empty. When I pulled into the driveway, the new welcome mat stared back at me like a taunt, and I could not shake the feeling that everything I had worked for was slipping away faster than I could grab it. The legal process stretched on for 11 months longer than any of us expected. Sophia fought hard presenting the security footage and the revoked authorization, and eventually the court dismissed the emergency motion. My family had to reverse the lock changes and drop the transfer attempts, but the fraud claims never went as far as full charges. Instead, my mother and father agreed to a quiet settlement that avoided criminal records, mostly because my older sister pushed them to settle before it got worse. I kept the house, every inch of it still mine, but the victory felt hollow. There were no apologies, no family dinners to mend things. My mother sent one last text saying I had chosen my path and they would respect it by staying out of my life completely. My father tried one private call afterward, his voice heavy with that same quiet anger from the confrontation, admitting he wished things had gone differently, but that he could not fight my mother and my older sister on it anymore. My older sister never reached out again, and her husband blocked my number entirely. I changed the locks back myself a few weeks later, the same young locksmith from Cheyenne who commented on how solid the original hardware had been. He did good work, and I tipped him well, but standing on the porch afterward with the key that finally turned felt lonelier than I had imagined. The garden I had planted after the divorce was blooming, the backyard quiet except for the wind through the trees. Yet the house no longer felt like the safe place it once had. Holidays came and went without a single call. Thanksgiving, I spent alone with a simple meal from the grocery store, scrolling through old photos on my phone while Emma and Oliver sent messages from their own family gatherings. Christmas was even quieter, the lights I put up feeling more like a reminder of what was missing than a celebration. Oliver stopped by once in the new year to help with a minor repair, and we talked for hours about how family could change overnight. He admitted he had tried to mediate once, but my mother had shut him down cold, saying some things could not be fixed. Emma invited me to join her family for a casual weekend barbecue later that spring, and I went grateful for the normal conversation and laughter. But driving home that night, the emptiness hit harder than ever. Evelyn called me late one evening after hearing through mutual friends that my older sister had told everyone I had cut the family off, out of spite twisting the whole story until it painted me as the villain. The rumor stung, but I did not fight it. I simply thanked Evelyn for the heads up and hung up, realizing that defending myself would only keep the door open to more pain. I still see my lawyer Sophia for occasional paperwork, and she always asks how I am holding up. I tell her the truth that the house is paid for and secure, but the quiet nights stretch longer now without the background noise of family texts or Sunday calls. My mother and father send the occasional holiday card through the mail. Nothing personal, just a printed signature that feels more like obligation than connection. My older sister and her husband have moved on, completely posting family photos online that never include me. I stopped checking those months ago. The independence I fought so hard to protect is mine, yet it comes with a loneliness I did not fully anticipate, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize some boundaries cannot be crossed without losing pieces of yourself along the way. Looking back, I learned that protecting what you built sometimes means standing alone in it. The maple tree I planted in the backyard the year after my divorce is tall. Now its leaves turning gold every autumn, just like it always did. But I mark the seasons without anyone to share the view. I still go to work each day as the senior financial consultant who knows how to spot hidden numbers and paper trails, but the evenings belong to me and the quiet house that no one else will ever claim. It is not the ending I once hoped for, but it is the one I chose when I decided I would not let anyone take what was mine. Some prices you pay in silence, and this one taught me that self-preservation can feel a lot like starting over completely alone. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever set a boundary with family and felt the loneliness that followed even when you knew it was the right choice, drop a comment below and tell me how you handled the quiet days after. Your stories help more than you know.